Ever wondered what it really takes to bounce back after a life-changing injury? You're in the right place. I'm Scott Schumann, and today on the Wellness Growth Show, I'm joined by Chaandani Khan, founder of Return to Life and a true expert in concussion recovery. We'll dive into her powerful story of overcoming identity loss, building a new path after her concussion, and how she's now helping others and the professionals who support them find real lasting recovery. If you or someone you know has been affected by a concussion, or you just want to hear an inspiring journey of resilience and hope, stick around. This episode is packed with insights you won't want to miss. Today we're sitting down with Chaandani Khan, founder of Return to Life. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So excited to have you. Let's start with your story. You had a life-changing experience that sparked Return to Life. Can you take us back to that moment?
Yeah, so to be able to do so, I'd like to share a little bit about my old self. So, my old self was a person who worked 50 to 70 hours a week in the events industry. I was traveling often for work as well as personal. I was an avid volunteer with different organizations as I grew up volunteering, and that's a big part of my heart and soul. I was very social, so I loved hosting people at my place. I loved going out often to restaurants or going out in the evenings. I had hobbies, I had sports, I made time for all these things and I was living a very fulsome existence. And so I was living that way for a long time and I was in a place in my life where I felt pretty sure of the direction I was going in, of things that I wanted, etc. And then one day I was in a car accident and that actually as of this month happens to be 6 years ago. So it's my 6-year anniversary month now in May. And in that car accident, I had neck and back injuries, but what I describe as the worst of all was a concussion brain injury that came from it. And so I went from living the lifestyle that I described all of a sudden to being a person who didn't know how to make a sandwich anymore. I had a very hard time leaving the house with two shoes on my feet. I would leave the house, look down, I'd see one shoe, one sock, and then I would just cry because I knew in the back of my mind something was wrong, but I just couldn't figure out what it was. I had a lot of troubles, following basic conversations, issues around word finding. I often found myself trying to describe something. Like, let's say I was trying to allude to the word door, and the word was just not coming to my mind. And given a word like door, in my experience, is what I would call a fairly basic word that I've been using for many years of my life. It's always been very easy for me to recall, and it's never, up until this point in my life after this injury, it never caused any issues. So then I found myself in this unique position where I was having a conversation and having to mime things out with my hands and say, the thing you go under, the thing it's in a room, it's between rooms, and trying to find other ways to communicate because I had a lot of communication trouble after my injury. So, as you can imagine, like these are some examples that I like to share to kind of breathe life into the depth of the experience. But there were a lot of cognitive challenges that I was facing above and beyond that. And as one could possibly imagine, who's gone through it, and maybe someone who hasn't, but it rippled into various other parts of my life as well. So, I went from this wild, work life of working 50 to 70 hours in events and traveling and having to be constantly on and traveling and working on airplanes and then working in a crowd of 100,000 to 500,000, so on. So I wasn't able to work. I wasn't able to, of course, with that, finances, controlling your own finances. I wasn't able to feel like a good friend and a good family member anymore because I wasn't able to show up for people in the same way that I always had. I wasn't able to be present. I wasn't, able to understand necessarily what they're saying, as well as I faced such an overwhelming level of fatigue that, doing very basic things in my life in survival mode, that's where my focus was. It wasn't in this luxurious place that I used to be in to be able to be with someone and talk to them and ask them and help them, and hobbies and volunteering and sports and, outdoor activities, those all fell by the wayside. Those were no longer a focus in my life. So that's just to kind of share a little bit about, where I came from and what happened after my injury.
And so after this injury and you're going through recovery and like what kind of care were you seeking, or who was able to help you?
Well, that's a great question. It's also a bit of a loaded question because that, the I'm getting myself all worked up here because I have so much to say to this to answer this question. When you have a concussion brain injury, I want to be careful the way I answer this because there are a lot of people doing great work, a lot of individuals and specialists who are, you know, responsible for treating various symptoms or bodily systems or needs that someone can have after this type of injury. But, what I discovered going through this firsthand was that you kind of have to know what to look for, which is really ironic. At this point in time, 6 years later, with all of my experience, with all the knowledge that I've gained for myself in this space, it's easy for me to sit here and say, it's almost like you need to have a guidebook before you're injured. And then you have your injury, and then you can flip through and be like, oh, with this symptom, I contact this person. With this bodily system issue, I contact that person. If I'm having, emotional regulation, this is how I would handle it. But that in reality, there are different systems and there are different, guidelines that are available, but standardized care is something that we don't see a lot of in terms of how it's rolled out. So, there are a variety of factors that feed into this. One of them being this common phrase in the space, which isn't mine. These are borrowed words, but when you've seen one concussion, you've seen one concussion. And let that stand for itself. Like the experience can be very subjective in terms of how a concussion brain injury manifests in any given person for a variety of factors. There can also be a variability in terms of how long somebody experiences the concussive symptoms for. What we're seeing in current research right now is that approximately 30% of concussion cases move into the persistent category. And what that means is that, to pull this apart a little bit, is that the majority of concussions are expected to heal in a couple of days to a couple of weeks. However, that 30% now we're seeing with research is continuing on. So people are then
Wow.
experiencing, yeah, and they're experiencing what's called PPCS, persistent post-concussive symptoms. That's where the symptoms are not resolved. They are potentially having new ones develop over time. And my own definition that I add to this from the lived experience perspective is that people's lives are generally derailed in various ways, if not complete ways, when they're going through something like PPCS.
Because they're told like it should be gone in a couple of days, and like you said, it may continue, and then they're not getting
Well,
the treatment, I'm guessing. So
yeah,
how did
I have to jump in there. There's a few holes, in terms of, well, there are many gaps in knowledge in terms of the general public, as well as in the medical communities, in other spaces as well. So concussions are expected to resolve in a few days to a few weeks, and the majority of them do. So, people are having these different experiences with concussion and resolving in that time frame. It's just that now there's finally it's exciting to see more interest and research and discussions happening around, well, what happens when they don't? And, as I mentioned, research, is giving us the 30% are moving into that persistent category. It's my personal opinion and thinking that when we continue diving into pulling apart PPCS and pulling apart what does recovery look like, that we will see a higher percentage.
how did you realize or come about what was missing in this whole system of, you said 30% and all these different numbers of like what treatment they're getting or not getting? So
Mhm.
how did you figure out what's missing?
Yeah, so first off is I lived it and I truly, you know, excuse my French here, but I went to hell and back in a lot of ways. I lived it and I didn't go into this knowing what I needed to know until I experienced it and then hit so many walls. So to pull this apart a bit, so in like where do I start with this? Oh my goodness, it's a meaty topic. In my experience, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what to look for. I didn't necessarily know what I was experiencing in different ways to be a symptom. You know, I didn't necessarily know that, oh, if I'm having this type of visual disturbance, this is the type of professional that I should see who works with people who've had concussions and have had this visual disturbance. It sounds so straightforward, and many injuries are straightforward. Well, I say this as a non-doctor, but
Okay.
for the general public, if someone has, let's say, a simple fracture of their arm, generally speaking, they go in for medical treatment. They are, the bone is set. They have a cast for X period of time. Maybe they are in physio or other physical treatments for X period of time, and then they're better. And it's a very clear roadmap, or generally speaking, it's a clear roadmap with something like a simple broken bone. With something like concussion, it doesn't work like that. As I mentioned before, there are guidelines, there are standards, there are checklists, there are professionals who are doing incredible work, but the experience itself can be subjective. And when the person themselves, like myself in this case, didn't know actively what to look for, you can be completely lost in the system. And I can very easily connect back to, I feel it in my body, like the feeling of being so emotionally dysregulated, having such a level of cognitive dysfunction that I had never experienced before. Issues being on screens, issues with sound, and trying to pull out my laptop once in a while to type concussion, help, concussion, what do I do? And just trying desperately to pull together any type of help or any type of resource. And what I kept on constantly coming up against was there isn't a one-stop shop. You have to know what to type into your laptop. You have to know what to search. And so, that was 6 years ago now, as I mentioned. And it's, even in this time frame, in the past 5, 6 years, there have been a lot of developments, and there's a lot more entrepreneurs stepping up to serve the concussion space in different ways. I think that a lot of businesses as well are pulling together more accessible guidelines, which is incredible. But that's the biggest piece, is that the way that I describe it is for the lived experience, people have to kind of patchwork their recovery path.
So you had mentioned earlier, like from being in these high functioning events, you were talking about like potentially hundreds of thousands of people, and then you're losing these basic skills. That's a massive shift. How did that reshape your view of yourself?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really great question, as this alludes to a topic that I try to speak to very, very well, very much frequently when I have the chance to sit down with someone and have this kind of conversation, or when I speak with someone who is going through PPCS, when I speak with various individuals involved in the medical community. Something that is not talked about enough, in my opinion, is the loss of identity that can occur after a concussion, as well as experiencing PPCS. So, like an extended period of time with concussion symptoms that are affecting your quality of life. And what emerged for me was it's a very deeply painful experience to go for X amount of time in your life, feeling like generally who you are, generally where you're going, and in some cases, very specifically, what you want, where you're going, what your plans are, what your trajectory is in your life. But then all of a sudden, to be in a position where you're not talking like yourself, you're not thinking like yourself, you're not acting like yourself, and then just find yourself one day thinking, well, if these things are all gone and the external factors that I define myself by are gone, well, then who am I? And this is something that it took me 6 months into this experience of, as I mentioned, no longer operating like the person I always knew myself to be, in all the ways, to lose a sense of self and a sense of identity, and then go into a spiral of like, oh my God, who am I? And that on top of having a brain that is not functioning cognitively the way it always used to. And on top of just trying to survive in many different ways in your life, in your own life. So identity, loss of identity absolutely reshaped going through the experience, experiencing loss of identity really it took away, who I was and how I thought I was. And then this opportunity was placed, in my lap and in the lap of many people who have concussion and PPCS, to eventually try to put the pieces back together. But one of the most fascinating things in this space is that when you go through this type of experience, you're all of a sudden a person where your mind is open to the fact that there is an old self that no longer exists, that and I want to also soften what I'm saying for anyone who might be listening who's actively going through this experience, that there is a path forward. You need to know there's a way forward, there's a way to build back, but you do build a new self.
How did this shape your view of what recovery or real recovery should look like?
Another great question. I think when you say real recovery, what comes to mind for me is just this super raw version of, it can be so messy. It can be so messy. You're trying to find a way to put one foot in front of another. Well, actually, and always potentially, metaphorically as well as physically in some senses, with, motor control and bodily function. But you're trying to find ways to move forward in your life in a space that is entirely messy. It's filled with uncertainty. One of the most difficult things is that there is no end date in sight. It isn't like, as I mentioned, a simple broken bone where it's like, well, in X amount of weeks or months, you will be here. And you have to find ways to navigate that piece. So the first part is very much just that recovery can be very raw, very messy, filled with uncertainty, confusion, frustration, also managing things that can happen after brain injury. Like anger is a very common emotion and response for a lot of reasons, whether it's the physical or going through various types of loss, as well as anxiety, as well as depression. These things are very common. They're also not talked about enough. Yeah, so it can look like that, but I also do want to, flip over to the other side of things and say that there's absolutely a way forward for every single person. The path will look different depending upon various factors, whether they're pre-existing factors someone has faced or currently what they're facing in their exact experience, the types of symptoms, the type of bodily systems that are affected. But there is a way forward. There are a lot of professionals who do treat lots of parts of your body, of your symptoms, of so on and so forth. As well, there are so many people, as I mentioned briefly a few moments ago, who are stepping up to serve the space in different ways. And myself going through this firsthand, what kept on constantly coming up for me in various appointments or when I was struggling the most is, what about the lived experience? What about the human experience behind this? And so that's something that I've incorporated in how I show up. Constantly. That's where I come from. Everything that I do is rooted in re-education around the lived experience. Um, yeah.
Okay. So leading into that, tell us more about Return to Life.
Thank you for asking. So Return to Life is a business that I had been dreaming up in little bits and pieces throughout the years, just knowing that I had to do something. I had to pave a new path forward. It didn't have to be this hard, the whole recovery experience and the level of challenges and struggles. Last year, I finally had the cognitive wherewithal to start actually building out the business. And, this year I've launched it a few months ago. That being said, I have been involved behind the scenes for a few years as going through my own recovery experience, then led into me specifically ingraining myself in the space in many different ways. So, connecting with people who have PPCS one to one, as well as staying in touch with a network of a few thousand people. So, constantly seeing what the pain points are, what people are facing, what the challenges are, the lived experience that's not often being reflected in medical treatment. And so, Return to Life is a business that I have created to help pave a new path forward. And specifically, the way that I'm doing that is I am teaching educational workshops to concussion professionals. So these are practitioners who serve the concussion population in various ways. These could be doctors, well, I shouldn't say could be, I'm specifically serving doctors, chiropractors, physiotherapists, kinesiologists, occupational therapists, and so many of the other incredible professionals that in body-based or medical ways.
Okay, great. And then how would you say that the business has evolved? Like, I know that you mentioned you've been at it for a few months, but I'm sure you've got years of documentation and whatnot, and
Mhm.
maybe share how's it grown?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, the lived experience component is so core to how I've moved through my own experience and how I serve. And so initially, where my heart is helping people. Helping people. I want to make it easier. I want to re-educate. I want to make education about concussion accessible. I want to pave a new path forward for different types of treatment that will really help to meet people where they're at. But my heart and soul at the end of the day is really on service to others based upon how badly I struggled and how I still can connect with how horrific it feels in many ways to be unseen, to feel unheard, to be, looking like yourself, but internally just not there whatsoever. So I initially started by serving people one to one. Where I was working with people with PPCS on a one-to-one basis, very specifically helping them to understand their mental energy and to optimize how they're showing up so they're able to return to everyday activities that they miss or potentially multiple activities in a day. Um, and so that truthfully, that is something that I still do on the side when I'm able to take on a new client. I love being able to do that because I get it because I've been there, I've lived it, I know it. I'm able to be one or two steps ahead. My own experience as well as talking to so many different people, that is invaluable. Someone who really knows exactly where you're at is able to be a couple steps ahead and really understand you on a very deep level. So that's how I started. That's what I'm doing, on the side as my heart is really in it. But overall, I aspire to lead lasting change in the overall concussion space. And I feel that the best way for me to do that is to serve businesses. And honestly, the second part, not really second, what I'm doing concurrently is I'm also developing out a lot of relationships with concussion specialists in all sorts of capacities because I have this larger scale goal that I'm driving towards, which is all of us coming together and being that change.
So you've started designing workshops and resources for clinicians. What made you see education and professional training as the next frontier for impact?
So I am fully teaching workshops now, actually, which is very exciting. I mean, I see it as education and innovation is the way forward in this space. There are a lot of advancements. There's a lot of research happening. There's a lot of, funding going towards various research, going towards, creating better resources for the public, as well as furthering the understanding in the medical community. And really, my approach, although is complementary to that. My unique selling point as a business owner is my lived experience. I mean, yes, I have ingrained myself in the space and educated myself in different ways on top of that. But truly, I show up with my lived experience. And essentially, it's no different, whether it's the medical community wanting to advance through education and innovation, or myself in a complementary way wanting to support that through education and innovation. That is the way forward. This space is very interesting because we're in the sort of what I refer to as sort of like a crossover place in terms of concussion. And I mean this, I feel like on a global scale. On one hand, there are these incredible advancements and so many people who really get it and they are leading their own way forward. But on the other hand, it's still a very archaic space. General public, a lot of people in the general public, regardless of which country we're speaking of in the world, still, don't necessarily have the updated information on concussion. A lot of sayings like, "Oh, it's just a knock on the head. Oh, you're seeing stars. You'll sleep it off. Oh, it's just a headache. It's fine. You'll be back. You'll be back tomorrow. You'll have a headache for a couple of days. Don't worry about it. It's just a concussion." That still very much exists. And for us to be able to make actual strides forward, take the public with us, make strides in the medical community to serve the public at a higher level, we need to root everything we're doing in re-education. And so that's how I choose to show up.
Yeah, sounds like there's a huge gap for that. Kudos to that. So you've been in contact with clinics and professionals, what, across Canada, US, UK, even New Zealand. Are there
Mhm.
any potentially like consistent gaps or missed opportunities you're seeing?
I mean, first off, concussion is underdiagnosed and undertreated. Hard stop. And, I always say that brain injury is not geographically limited. And so this rings true for many thousands upon thousands of people across the world in various cities, countries, towns who are experiencing concussion. I was speaking with a neurologist a couple of weeks ago, and it was so fascinating from his experience where he said he sees, locals, so Canadians, but he also sees a lot of people who are from international clients from a lot of different countries. And he said one of the most fascinating things that he's noticed is that, despite the country difference, despite language differences, despite all these, various factors at play, people with this type of injury, concussion and PPCS, they tend to have a similar set of symptoms. And, to me, I mean, it's incredible to hear that from him, but it's also like, well, of course, right? Because we're all humans, we all have a brain. And, so that is one piece is that, the human brain is the human brain, regardless of where you are in the world. Concussion is underdiagnosed, it is undertreated. I see, just a ton of opportunity. Again, I like to be careful the way that I speak to this because there are a lot of individuals and clinics and researchers and medical professionals who are leading their own way forward. And I I appreciate that. I admire them. I want to work with them. Let's collaborate. But that's one of the biggest things that really unites us across the world. And this type of approach that I'm taking from lived experience, I feel so privileged to be able to have lived some of the worst years of my life, moved forward painstakingly slowly in some ways, but here I am at last. And now be able to do something with this, take actionable steps to change the space and to come together and collaborate with others in doing so.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I mean, creating your own story. I mean, from your own experience, your own lived experience.
Mhm.
and finding ways, finding purpose, right? So what's what piece of advice you'd give someone just starting their
So the first thing I would say, more so than advice, is just a very firm reminder. And the reminder is you are not alone. It's very easy in this experience to slip into down the slippery slope of isolation and of not feeling seen, not feeling understood, not knowing what's going on inside your own brain, inside your own body, and just feeling very lost. You couple that with people externally being like, "Oh, you look great. You look fine. You must be doing so much better. Wow, you did X, Y, and Z so well today. You must be better." But then feeling that dichotomy within yourself of like, I am barely functioning, and feeling like everyone kind of, not everyone, but it is common in this experience to develop the skill of masking. For better or for worse, that's where, you're just, "Oh, yeah, yeah, thank you." And yeah, so it's very easy in this space to slip down that slope of total isolation, and you need to know that you are not alone. There are thousands of people experiencing what you're experiencing, and I mean that in a very validating way. There is a lot of help out there.
Okay. What about professionals trying to support that journey better?
Mhm. Really great question. Of course, this is where I'm putting all my focus, all my attention, all my energy these days. So, for professionals, I'd say very first, if you are a professional who's treating concussed individuals or the concussion population, first off, thank you. Second, I really appreciate when professionals have a vested interest in concussion and learning more about it, as it's not necessarily covered in a lot of mainstream curriculum, more so than just like a very high level. So, those two things, I'm like, thank you genuinely for your service, for your interest, for your work. The most important thing I'd say for professionals is to find a way to equip yourself with a little bit of knowledge on the actual experience of concussion, the lived experience, if you are a professional who doesn't possess the lived experience yourself. Those pieces, like that is what I've seen in my experience and from what I've heard from, hundreds of other people who have gone through this type of experience, that is often the missing piece. And I also want to, preface this with saying that I very much understand that different professionals are meant to specialize in specific areas by design, and we want them there. So I'm not suggesting that professionals, you know, spend hours and hours and days and weeks and months learning these things, but just enough so that you're really able to meet your patient where they're at. Maybe that's bridging gaps in language and communication. That's one of my most popular workshops is effective communication with the concussed population. Finding ways, whether it's, contacting someone like myself or someone else who's doing this type of work in the space. That is what I urge you to do.
Great. This has been so informative. Tell the people where can they connect with you or learn more about you.
Thank you. So I welcome all sorts of collaborations, partnerships. I am a community-minded person. I love hearing from people. I'm actively reaching out to build my network, build my community in this space. So please find me via LinkedIn. It'll be included in the show notes. My first and last name, Chaandani Khan. Definitely look for the spelling in the show notes. I know it's a hard one. You can also find me at my website, which is return to life, spelled traditionally.ca, www.returntolife.ca.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of The Wellness Growth Show. If today's conversation sparked something for you, hit subscribe so you don't miss the stories, strategies, and insights from the front lines of wellness innovation. If you're a founder, operator, or health leader exploring growth into institutional markets and have a story worth telling, I'd love to hear from you. Reach out directly on LinkedIn or YouTube. And if you found this valuable, share it with a peer or post it online. You never know who needs to hear it. Until next time, stay well, keep moving, and keep building what matters.